In this video, I'll show you how we can use the pivot table feature in Google Sheets to look in a column of categorical data and organize it. And what I mean by that is we want to take what's in a column of categorical data, and we want to create a table so that the table is telling us the number of each of the labels in that column. So what we'll do is, if I were to look at the column B for type of hospital, we want to know the number of system hospitals that are in this column. Now, I could go, because we're only dealing with 24 hospitals, I could go through and count 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, the number of times I see system. I could do the same thing for independent hospitals and the same thing for network hospitals. Again, because we're dealing with, in this case, 24 hospitals, it's not too terribly hard to go through and count. However, if we were dealing with a data set that had hundreds or thousands of individual observations, we would not want to have to go through and count all the different labels that are in that column. So what we can do is use what is called the pivot table. And the pivot table allows you to do multiple things, and we'll see later in this module, we'll be able to calculate measures of center, mean, median with the pivot table. But here we're just going to have the program, Google Sheets, go through that column and count the number of times something appears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click anywhere in the spreadsheet, and I will click on the top, Data, and Pivot Table. You'll notice that at the bottom of the sheet, a new tab will be created. It's called Pivot Table 4. You might have something Pivot Table or Pivot Table 1, Pivot Table 2. This is the fourth one that I've created, so it called it Pivot Table 4. And it's blank. There's nothing here. On the right side, what we want to do is to tell this program what we want on the rows and the columns of this table. So I'm going to, as we just saw, we're looking at column B, I'm going to be looking at the type of hospital. And we can put this in either rows or columns. Either one is appropriate. I prefer columns, but I'm going to go back and show you rows in a second. So under columns, I will click on Add Field, and we want to look at the type of hospital. Right, this is the system, independent, or network. And when you select that, under the columns area, over on the left-hand side, we now see independent, network, and system are now individually in their own column. We also have a grand total that is listed there. Now underneath that, under row 2, it's totally blank. So this is where we need to go over and look at the values parameter. So under values, we can add a field, and this is what's going to populate the information underneath each one of these labels: independent, network, and system. So I'm going to click on Add Value, and again we're looking at type of hospital. So I will click on Type of Hospital, and immediately we see that underneath all of those we have zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0. And this is because what the Google Sheets is doing right now is going through and it is summing all of the independent hospitals. And we're getting 0. The reason that this is weird here is because we can't add independent and independent and independent. There aren't numbers. They're categories or labels. So adding them together, you're not going to get anything meaningful. So what we want to summarize is not the sum, but we want the program to go through and to count the number of times independent appears, the number of times network appears, and the number of times system appears. So we're going to select Count A. If you select just count, that's a different operation, that's a different function. It's going to do something different. We want Count A. And that's going to go down and count all the independents, all the networks, and all the systems. So I'm going to select Count A. And now we see on the left-hand side in our table, there were 8 independent hospitals, 4 network hospitals, and 12 system hospitals. There's 24 total hospitals, which we already knew. This again is how we can use the pivot table. I selected in columns, I selected the categories that I wanted, in this case of the type of hospital, so it found the 3 different categories of independent, network, and system. The values, I wanted to match that, right, where we want to know the unique time, the number of times the independent hospitals were listed, so we had to select type of hospital and count A. Now I'm going to delete these, because remember I said you could also do rows. Let's see what happens if we put the type of hospital in rows. Well, that's just going to put the independent, network, and system all in one column, so that we have independent, network, and system individually. Their values will be tagged with them in an individual row. So now I want to go to values, and I'll do the same thing. Select the type of hospital, because that's the column that I'm interested in. And I don't want the sum, I want count A. And now we have the same information presented in rows. Independent, there are 8. 4 network, 12 system, 24 in total. It doesn't matter if you like this view better than the other view. By all means, use this. I tend to go back and forth, but probably use the columns a little bit more. But honestly, it depends. The last thing I want to show you here is how we can take this information and copy and paste it onto a Google document or a Word document. For your assignment that you'll have in a few weeks, you'll need to be able to create a table. So this is something you'll absolutely need to be able to do. Once you create this pivot table, you can select by clicking and dragging, hitting Command C for copy. And then on your document, whether you create a blank document or you have a Word document open, if you go and hit Control V for paste, you'll be prompted, if you are in Google, do you want to have it linked or unlinked? You'll want to select unlinked. And there you go. Now you have this table that you copied and pasted into your Google document. You're now free to write anything you would like related to this table. So we're back looking at the data. What I want you to do is to try to look at the size column. Create a pivot table to find the number of hospitals that have 0 to 300 beds, the number of hospitals that have 300 to 600 beds, and the number of hospitals that have 600 plus beds. So create a pivot table where you are specifically looking at this column for size. If you want to pause your video now and try that, please do that. I'm going to, in a moment here, show you how to do that. I will click anywhere in the spreadsheet, go up to Data, Pivot Table. You'll notice that another Pivot Table tab has been created at the bottom of my document. Using either rows or columns, you want to select the size. Under values, you will also select size. And we want to summarize by the count, but we want to use the function count A. This tells me we have 0 to 300. We have 7 hospitals that have that size. 300 to 600 beds, there are 11 hospitals. And 600 plus beds, we have 6 hospitals. The last thing I want to show you is how we can utilize rows and columns to break this information down even more. So suppose I wanted to look at this information, the size, but also then looking at in the columns, I want to look at the various types of hospitals. So if I go under columns, if I add a field and I break that down by type of hospital, you can see what happens. It actually breaks this down even further. We see that there are 5 independent hospitals that have 0 to 300 beds. There are 2 independent hospitals that have 3 to 600 beds, and 1 independent hospital has more than 600 beds. So you can use any combination of rows and columns to break this down even more to see the different categories and how they relate to one another.